And welcome everybody. It feels like it was only yesterday when we were doing another one of these. In fact, it was 2 weeks ago. But we live in exciting times. So today we're going to talk around a second mass exploit kit that has been detected out in the wild. This has been dubbed DarkSword, not our choice of name. This was actually what it was named by the person or people that wrote it. We're going to go into this in more detail. I will say, as Nicole mentioned, please put any questions into the Q&A panel. We won't have time to actually answer them during the presentation. We'll have a Q&A session at the end where we'll go through those questions that have been posted there. We will also have a second Q&A session. When that one finishes, I'll get Nicole to stop the recording. And then if any of you that wanted to ask a question but didn't want to ask because it was being recorded, we will let you know the recording stopped, and then you can feel free to ask those questions as well. So with that, let's crack on and get started. So I'm Spencer Parker. I'm Chief Product Officer here at iVerify. Joining me today is Matthias Freislingdorf, our VP of Research, who's been the driver behind all the work that you're going to be seeing today, and a number of other of our research team as well. This is the second mass exploit framework that we've seen. And just a little bit of potted history here around iOS. We're starting to see what we're calling the fourth age of iOS exploitation. If you look back over the years of iOS, there was very limited exploitation, in the beginning. There wasn't a lot of CVEs published. It didn't mean there wasn't a lot of exploits, but there wasn't a lot of CVEs published. Over time, more and more of those things have been published. Probably things in the realms of nation states have been in there. The commercial spyware vendors, the rise of Pegasus, Predator, Graphite, RCS Labs. There's been a whole slew of venture capital money thrown at this part of the space. So there's been a lot of them out there, particularly the ones being able to provide these types of services for the nation states that hadn't got their own exploit frameworks at this time. But 2026 is definitely turning into the year of mass criminal attacks. And mass usage of these types of technologies against large swathes of population. So this is no longer that high value target type problem that we had with commercial spyware. So let's get into the weeds on DarkSword. So we identified that there were multiple hacked websites in Ukraine that were being utilized as watering holes, targeting specifically Ukrainian IP addresses. We discovered this about 1 hour after we went public with Coruna. So Matthias and team, there was champagne going all around, patting on the backs. They finally thought they could get some sleep after 2 very hard weeks of analyzing Coruna. There was no rest for the wicked. So they've now had another 2 weeks of manic reverse engineering, forensic troubleshooting, and all sorts of things going on to find exactly what this kit could do compared with Coruna. And we found that there were 2 exploit chains involved in this attack, totaling 6 different vulnerabilities. But this targeted specifically iOS versions 18.4 to 18.62. That is a much larger blast radius than Coruna, which could target iOS 13 through 17.21. But the number of devices that were on those was probably, circa around 5% of the iOS devices out there. This, when it went live in November last year, this would have been 0-day attacks. 18.62 was pretty much one of the most deployed iOS versions out there at this time. iOS 26 had just come out, but this was the first time Apple had faced a backlash problem from their users against the Liquid Glass UI that was deployed in 26. And a lot of people were staying on 18 because they didn't want to upgrade to that new Liquid Glass UI. And so this could target a huge number of devices that were out there. We think somewhere in the realms of between 200 to 250 million iOS devices. So a much larger blast radius than Coruna could have done, although limited in scope because this was only serving this to Ukrainian IPs. And we were able to download the entire framework, so the full exploit framework and implants. Um, this was not Coruna. There is absolutely no overlap here, other than the same threat operator was using this against Ukraine as was Coruna was used in the summer of 25 against Ukraine. So this is a totally different code base, totally different authors. This is not linked to any, Five Eyes leaks, unlike the Coruna one. Also, there was no Android targeting done in this one whatsoever. So we do not attribute this to any specific adversary, although Google, who we've partnered with in this as well as Lookout, have linked them to a targeting group, UNC 6353. And we believe it's likely nation state because just of what it's trying to do, and the fact that it's targeting Ukraine only. We've also seen that Google attributed the exploit framework to be used in two other cases to a company called Pars Defense, who's based in Turkey. We call them Luna Ronin as our moniker for that adversary, but they were not involved in the Ukrainian attack. So Google had previously seen this being used in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Malaysia during 25. And they'd seen some of those installs affecting phones 18.4 to 18.7. So certainly the one in Saudi Arabia could target up to 18.7. But Turkey and Malaysia were definitely attributed to Pars Defense. So this framework, although we don't suspect it was written by them, it had been sold and used by Pars Defense in these Turkey and Malaysia operations that they'd sold their wares out to. I mean, there are different implants involved in all of these attacks. So we do believe the implants involved in Turkey and Malaysia were Pars Defense implants. But again, we do not think that is the case in the Ukrainian one at all, which is the one we're going to talk about today, because that's the one that we actively investigated and saw. So with that, I'm now going to pass across to Matthias, and he's going to go through this in much greater detail with you all.
Thank you, Spencer. Yeah, happy to dive a little bit into this. The entire investigation started 2 weeks ago, pretty much like Spencer said, an hour after we published our findings about Coruna. And at this point in time, Google also published that Coruna was used in Ukraine before. And when we were looking at the infrastructure and the domains that were used by that Ukrainian threat actor, we also stumbled across that cdncounter.net address, which was hosting a widget.js file, but it was also hosting something that is called rce_walker.js, rce_module.js, so on and so forth. RCE in that like hacker term is like for remote code execution, immediately like sparked some of our like spidey senses in that way that we wanted to like look into it. And we quickly found that this had some configuration data for iPhones on 18.4 to 18.6.2. Yeah, and then we went into full mode and obviously tried to capture more of this. In the first stage, we tried to infect phones on 18.4 and 18.5. We didn't manage to get both of these phones infected. Then we had to acquire some iPhones on like the 18.6 versions on the, let's say, back market really quickly. And once we did that, we actually also successfully managed to infect the phone. Previously, we also attempted to like manually crawl to the server and capture the different parts by just like starting at the first RCE module, looking at the JavaScript code, and then we found, oh, there is a link to the next RCE module, then there was a link to a sandbox escape, and finally to the privilege escalation. And that way for itself is, let's say, way too easy that we just could capture a very, very expensive exploit chain in it alone, and I'm going to get back to that a little bit later on. Yeah, so the results that we had was an affected iPhone on 18.6.2, and we saw the distinct exploit chains for 18.4 and 18.6, and we also saw that a large part of the file system um, was accessed and also exfiltrated by the piece of malware. Now, let me go into the methodology and talk about how we did discover this. The first thing is that what we try to do as a like forensics, but also like a malware like known company is we want to focus on static, dynamic, and forensic analysis in order to tear these things down. That means we want to monitor the full network traffic between our like test phones that we're infecting and the server that is hosting the exploits to see all of the communication that goes back and forth. We're analyzing crash logs, sysdiagnosis, other like diagnostics data such as unified logs, and we're also taking encrypted backups, always pre and post infection. Unfortunately, for this particular device, we didn't have any like iOS version that could be jailbroken, so we couldn't capture just like easily a full file system dump and just see at all the bits and pieces where things were dropped on disk or where things were happening for the chain. So we have to basically work with whatever like public data collection tools that are applicable. And then as you can see here, this is a screenshot from that network proxy that we can use to see that it all started with that Ukrainian news page, novosti.dn.ua. Then it moves over to the static CDN counter.NAT widgets, and then basically goes into the RCE loader worker module, sandbox escapes, and then the PE main. What you can also see here is that this specific exploit loves to lock wherever they are in their current exploit flow by different stages. Natively, it has about 110 log messages until it hits the like final privilege escalation, while you can easily turn on more detailed logging and then you get like to 400 different log messages, which is super nice from an analysis perspective. But it is also super noisy, and it tells anyone who wants to understand how this works pretty much what are the bells and whistles. Let's move ahead. Yeah. So we start the entire infection chain here by two domains, novosti.dn.ua and 7aac.gov.ua. The latter one is a government domain, and the first one is a news domain, and both of them were infected by very likely that Russian threat actor that Google attributed this to. And they infected both of these domains to load a small iframe that would be redirecting based ln to the attacker's domain. Then this one loads the remote code execution stages. This is like the first initial part where they get code execution inside of Safari. More precise, the WebKit part. This is the browser engine. And then after those were loaded, they have to bypass a couple of added mitigations from Apple over time. And then they move over to two sandbox escapes. The first sandbox escape allows them to get basically code execution in Apple's GPU process. The second one allows them to switch over to media playback D, where they will load the final part of the chain, which is a kernel privilege escalation, and the PA main.js, which is responsible for this, but it also contains the implant for this. Google has named this implant Ghostblade. There's also other implants like Ghost Saber and Ghost Knife, which have been also observed in the different chains in Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and Turkey. But in general, after this stage, like after the privileged escalation, you can load whatever JavaScript implant you want to load in order to do a lot of different things. The entire chain itself is built in JavaScript, and it doesn't surface any traditional binary implant or libraries which would be injected into other processes. This is unlike Coruna, where they started with JavaScript and then they moved over to like native code execution, or even like more traditional CSV vendors, such as Pegasus, where they load an implant after all the exploitation stages. We are planning on detailing the implant behavior and some of these techniques that are used here because they're very elegant and very novel. in further parts or like in further blog posts in the future. But for now, given that so many iOS devices are still impacted and it is too easy to steal, we're not going to go into much further detail. Let's move one slide ahead, please. The vulnerabilities which have been used in this chain, and the table is basically in order of when they have been patched. It's not in order of the execution. Starts first with a vulnerability that was patched in 18.4. This is a first vulnerability that will allow you to like get code execution inside of Safari. This was patched in 18.6. It doesn't have a in the wild designation, and it's very unlikely that Apple did knew at this point in time that it could have been already exploited in the wild. The next vulnerabilities which have been patched are the two vulnerabilities used in the kernel exploit. Both of them have been patched in 18.7.2. So in 18.7.2 and also in 26.1. At the point of time when this was patched, it could be likely, but it's probably more unlikely that this was also already known to Apple that it was exploited in the wild. It's more likely that they found these bugs by themselves and then patched them. But we can see that both of these vulnerabilities have the same release date or were added as the other two vulnerabilities that were used as the initial remote code execution, which were patched in 26.2. Interestingly, both of these vulnerabilities have a in the wild designation, and they're attributed as like the discovery part to Google's threat intelligence group. But I don't know why Apple decided to not give these two kernel vulnerabilities an in the wild designation. And then finally, in 26.3, a user mode pack bypass was patched just about a month ago. Also, this one was not backported yet, but it also contains the in the wild designation. Let's go ahead, please. So if we're looking at the results and the kind of files that were accessible to this spyware, you can clearly see here that this is a lot. And we can clearly also see that in this case, the implant was more likely to develop, was more likely to developed by the exploit author. You can see here, this is a list of like forensic files that are targeted. The exploit developer here gives nice documentation of what are like data categories and what are like databases that it could be targeting. They even provide a description here. In this case, we have communications data, we have Wi-Fi, we have browser data, location data, personal data. There's also health data that is targeted here, both databases. There is WhatsApp, Telegram, which are also captured. There is all the passwords which are in the keychain in both Wi-Fi passwords, but also like standard, like browser-based passwords. There is 16 different categories of data that they're tracking in many, many, many databases. This is like the who is who of things that you want to take a look at if you would want to like analyze the pattern of life of a person, or if you would be just doing a forensic investigation into an iPhone for criminal investigations or other places. This is really, really a lot of sensitive and intimate data, and it would give the attacker everything there is to know about you as a person if it's stored on the phone. Additionally, that specific module also had support for searching for specific apps. Some of these apps were like also cryptocurrency apps, and if they were found, they would be also uploading all of these files to the exploit server. You can see a full list of all the databases and targeted data in our blog post, but it's a little bit too much to just put them here on the slide. Let's go ahead, please. What this makes this entire chain very interesting is also the OPSECs that we have seen. We saw that whoever sold this had many, many comments, many, many different pieces that they put into this. And we also saw that it was very, very easy for us to just basically extract the entire chain. So I have no idea why the OPSEC is the way it is. There is a couple of theories that we have for this. Like it could be that they just thought, we have so many exploits that we can just buy. I don't care if this one gets disclosed. Or maybe it is so hard to detect these kind of chains and there's so little tools available that they just didn't care. Or they also just could have just not known how valuable these chains are that they had in their hands. But speaking about detection, because this is written in JavaScript and the way it behaves on the system, detecting DarkSword is very much different from detecting other commercial spyware that we have seen in the past. It doesn't launch its own implant processes. It doesn't even keep a consistent or like continuous communication back to command and control servers. It just gets into it, spawns into other system processes, steals all the data that it has, uploads it, and that's it. This is way, way more stealthy than previous attempts, just in terms of behavior and traces they're leaving behind on the device. That doesn't mean it's impossible to detect it. It's just it requires a little bit a different approach. We have built IOCs and we are sharing IOCs in our blog post on how to detect the specific threat live by the files and parts and bits and pieces that they're accessing. We are also sharing behavior where exploit might be crashing or where the exploits are deleting particular things. For example, they're removing crashes and crash log directories, but they're failing to remove two crash log directories which are on the phone. So if they're just deleting the one, you have a clear indication that something is a little bit weird on the phone. Well, the other one was not deleted. There's plenty of crashes and log messages, which are giving away the specific exploit chain, but also the implant behavior. We have built support for this into all of our iVerify apps for both enterprises, but also consumers. And we have made the iVerify basic app for free. We already did that for Coruna, but we will continue to do this. So anyone has a chance to check their phones for like live infections of this particular kit. Additionally, we also included all of the domains into a sticks2 file that you can use with MVT. It's going to be attached in our blog post. And these initial access domains are not cleaned up. So there is a good chance of still finding like old infection behavior based on this. We have also included the domains that Google shared on their web page as well. So you can check all of these three different DarkSword-based campaigns just with the sticks2 files that we're including. A quick note on this, I've also added a second sticks2 file that contains the two domains which were used in the waterhole attack. But because these are very legitimate websites and they got infected, I've named this suspicious. So please be careful if you use this for checking. Just because someone accessed that web page, it doesn't mean they got infected. It's just a good indication for doing further work. And as I said, because this is all JavaScript, it is super easy to just deploy this. In order to get the reliability a little bit up and to like continuously check our own phones, we have deployed this like locally on our own computers, and it just didn't take us more than a couple of hours to change this. So anyone could have just that would have found these different like parts or exploits and would have just captured them the same way that we did, could have easily used and deploy these on their own servers. Changing the config files for the C2 is super easy. And if you don't want to run it locally, but like on a normal server, it's even faster. I don't hope that this is going to happen, but we do expect that people caught this and that proliferation of these exploit frameworks is at some point in time going to happen, the same way that we have seen this with Coruna. And that's it, as simple as that. I can only say, please patch your devices, make sure that you're going on to iOS versions that are not impacted. Tell whoever you know that might be still running vulnerable that they should be really careful or like upgrade. Yeah, this is everything that I can tell you on the detailed part of this, and I'm happy to give it back to Spencer, who is going to talk a little bit more on what this actually means for us.
Thanks very much, Matthias, for that very detailed explanation there. Yeah, I mean, just to think more broadly about the implications of this, I mean, this is the second time in a month we have seen an exploit framework now on iOS. We have a saying in the UK, you wait forever for a bus and then two turn up at the same time. Well, that's exactly what happened here. That's not to say we're going to see a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, however many of them now. We're probably more likely to see proliferation of the current ones out there, and we have the detections in place now in iVerify to be able to detect the behaviors of these things. So it doesn't matter how obfuscated they become, how much code is changed. If those same exploit chains are being used, we'll be able to detect them. And the reality is now there is still a very large proportion of devices out there that this thing can attack. And these are the ones that we've detected. We are fully aware that there are other exploit frameworks out there that the governments have, that commercial spywares have, that are infecting phones to this day running the latest versions of code. So we know that this is going to be a problem, and that this really is now a game changer in terms of how we think about security on iOS. This has really changed how we do security, and how we are going to have to look at these devices as not the secure device that we once believed them to be. The reality is, iOS devices, when fully patched, are still probably the most secure device that you are going to have in your pocket. That is the reality of the situation. But now the security certainly feels a lot less secure than it did, 2 weeks ago. And it does sort of start to beg the questions around, how big and well equipped is the market out there for iOS 0 days and end days for iOS devices? You know, we know that even the e-criminals out there, the shiny hunters and the likes of this world, these are very well-funded groups now, often bringing in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in ransoms and things like that. There are groups out there that can absolutely afford to buy these exploit kits. So things like the Pall-Mall process and things like that become extremely important here in trying to mitigate as many of those sales as possible to people that you wouldn't want to have these things. Again, there are totally legitimate uses of this technology for lawful interception, for instance. If you're going after a cartel or somebody like that using these types of devices, there are the right ways of doing this. But there's absolutely been a ton of documented wrong ways of doing this and wrong people to target. And now these are in the hands of e-criminals. They're going to target as many people as they possibly can. So we're going to see this change. We're going to see this continue to move much more quickly now than it has done for many years previously on iOS. These exploits, they're available now. I mean, there's at least 4 GitHub repositories I know of the Coruna ones that are free to download. We have deliberately, alongside our partners in this, so we partnered both with Google and Lookout, and again, a massive public thank you to those security threat research teams as well for all the work that we did. I mean, we would never have got to this state where we are now in 2 short weeks without the collaboration at the back end between these threat research teams to be able to get this out. So that has allowed us to do that. We have the blogs available now. We all launched simultaneously on that. So all 3 of us have our blogs and our data available. Every one of us has come at this in a slightly different way as well. So, there is no one source of complete truth for all of this. But definitely, I would encourage you to read all 3 blogs to get the biggest picture that you can out of this. And we tried to share some of this, especially the Google knowledge that they had, that this stuff was being used prior to the Ukrainian attacks, which is where ourselves and Lookout came into the picture on this one. So big thank you to those guys as well. So why does this matter to us? It just brings that new scale of attack. This is no longer thinking that, who do I have to protect on iOS? I've only got to protect the high value targets, the people that would have money spent on them by other people to attack them. These nation state grade mobile exploits are now commoditized, pretty much for free if you want the Coruna stuff now. To say we're holding back the publication of the exploit chain right now on the DarkSword stuff just because, it affects too many live phones at the moment. And we want to make sure that we have reported this all to Apple. We want to make sure Apple can respond and patch what they want to patch. We have no control over that. That is totally Apple's to do. But we saw Apple, for instance, with Coruna, go and back patch some versions of iOS they claimed were out of support and were never going to be patched again. So they understand how important this is, and how big a security issue this is going to become. This really is total data compromise of your phone. I mean, the fact that this thing could go and steal whatever files it wanted off the system. I mean, it limited itself in what it stole more than what it technically could do. I mean, for instance, this one didn't steal all your photographs off the phone. That again would have made it very noisy, and huge amounts of data coming off phones would have been noticeable. Being able to just steal the relevant databases off the phone, to get them what they needed. So it was more surgical in its precision here. It's part of what they're doing, but it's not that it couldn't have taken it. It chose not to. And there's a big difference there. And thinking of security on iOS as MDM or MAM, I'm sorry, but that is not security of the device. They cannot detect that type of attack. You need what traditionally was called a mobile threat defense type product, or what we now call mobile EDR, to be able to detect this type of thing. Of course, which is iVerify is one of those. We've also, this is the second reported mass IO attack in 2 weeks. As I say, it could just be a total fluke that we found them in 2 weeks. Or this could be the start of a new trend. I hope for Matthias and team's sake it isn't a new trend, but only time will tell on this. Those guys need a bit of sleep now, I think, is the reality here. But we need to find these things. So what are some recommended actions? I mean, what can we do? We recommend, obviously, patch these devices as quickly as you can. We know that the latest 26 builds, 26.3 and above, are not affected by this. We know that that there were breaks in the patch. I think it was 18.74 is also the latest iOS on the 18s would have also broken these chains as well. Didn't patch every one of them, but it patched enough to break the 2 chains that were in here. So definitely get onto that as soon as you possibly can. You need to then also have a historical look at the data that you have available to you to find out, who would have been vulnerable, during the campaign windows and things like that. Do you have staff in Ukraine, for instance, that could be affected by this, things of that side of things. So you need to also find that, what is the potential to be have infected your users. After 30 days, we say, let's start enforcing mandatory updates. Liquid glass isn't as bad as everyone says it is. You get used to it within a couple of hours. It's not that bad, and if we have to upgrade everybody to 26.3 to stop this problem, let's just do it. So we need to get a more forceful patching. But obviously, if you've got BYODs in your environment, that you have no control over that patching and things of that nature. Education is going to be a critical thing to those end users to understand why they should be patching, rather than why they're not. And if they don't, I mean, there are tools, as I say, like iVerify Enterprise that you can deploy to those devices whilst maintaining the privacy on them, and still be able to detect this stuff in real time. You need to do an audit and review here, and finally, look at your threat intel. How do you get this data more regularly into your your tips and things like that to be able to understand more future as a service threats that are coming out through the misuse of these exploit frameworks. Just a brief touch upon who iVerify are. We're one of the leaders in the mobile endpoint detection and response solutions. We specialized for years on iOS, but we also do Android as well. Android is a little bit easier to do. There are frameworks for us to be able to do things on Android that allow us to become a very effective security tool there. iOS has been a very tough nut to crack. So this enables us to be able to get unprecedented data off the device in a way that is allowed by Apple. Our apps are in the App Store, so they are blessed by Apple's reviews. So we're not running exploits on the phone or do it using private APIs that need enterprise certificates or anything like that. So we're very simple to deploy. And you need to be able to do that full behavioral threat hunting across both iOS in this case and Android more broadly as well. You need to be looking for the types of commercial spyware implants that are common. Even on Android now, with the likes of Landfall, we're starting to see um, commercial spyware vendors pivot away from APK files into the world of fileless malware as well on Android. So you need these types of advanced techniques to be able to detect this stuff. SIM swap protection is also a critical part of this thing. And continuously getting updated mobile threat intelligence into those products to be able to find all of this stuff is part and parcel of what Matthias and team do here at iVerify. So very happy if anyone wants a demo of the solution, just please feel free to contact us at info@iverify.io and we'll be able to set up a demo for you and show you what we can do. So just one last slide before we get to questions and answers. So some closing remarks here. What else could we have done? The reality is if you did run an iOS device in lockdown mode, it would have stopped this attack from happening. Running iOS, unfortunately, though, in lockdown mode is not for everybody. It does change the way the phone works and some of the way it interacts with websites and things like that, and it can break things. So it is not for everybody and maybe not the best idea. Clearly right now, one of the best ideas to cover these known attacks is to patch. But it's the unknown attacks that are going to worry the hell out of you now because that's where the 0 days do exist. And of course, installing iVerify Enterprise for the corporate side of things, it will protect you there on the phones on that side of things. But for consumers, to pass this on to them, we've made our iVerify Basic product free until the end of May, so they can run protection on their own devices. That's free. It's not like a subscription or anything like that. Once you've downloaded it free, it is free for life. So there's no ongoing costs or anything. It's not like the first month free or anything like that. It is literally free. So with that, I'm going to bring up the Q&A panel and have a look at any questions here. So strangely, I'm not seeing any questions from you all. This is either our presentation has been so good and so detailed that we've answered every question that you may have, or you're all too scared to answer it during the recorded session and you're waiting for us to finish the recording so you can ask your questions then. But please, if you've got some questions, put some say. Would you say the main? So we've got a question here. Would you say the main entry point is WebKit? Tess, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, it's 100% WebKit. The entire chain is built on Safari exploitation, and it's the only entry point into this. The later stage vulnerabilities could have also been used by potentially different components or by an app, but the main part getting into code execution is WebKit.
We've got another question here, which I'll take. It says, can you confirm that if the device is updated and after compromised, that it completely ejects DarkSword? Well, there's two parts actually to that question to answer it. So firstly, DarkSword ejects itself after it's finished running. So again, to clean itself up and remove it, once it's exfiltrated the data, it removes itself totally from the system. Doesn't need to run again. Obviously, with things like that news site, which you may be visiting daily, it's going to run daily because you're reinfecting yourself on every visit to that website. So yes, it cleans itself up once it's run and exfiltrated. You don't even need to reboot the device to do that. But obviously, during an OS update, it does do a reboot. Therefore, a reboot also does kill the dark. So if it was just starting its exploit chain when you were running, it would kill the exploit from running on the system, and you'd have to revisit that website to reinfect yourself again. Now, you may have that web page open and you open up your browser again and it reloads that page in again and it would reinfect you again. So the act of rebooting does clean the system, just like all this non-persistent commercial spyware that we see. A reboot is enough to clean the system, which is why people should regularly reboot their phones anyway. Many people don't reboot their phones until there's an OS upgrade. That is not good security OPSEC with these devices. A daily reboot is a good thing.
Maybe one thing to add. It is absolutely possible that threat actors could change the behavior, so they could also just stay longer in memory if they wanted to. And we've seen other threat actors leveraging the same exploit kit, even implementing like a command and control module. That particular piece that we've observed in Ukraine just gets resolved automatically, but other pieces might stay as long on the device as it's not rebooted. And if you upgrade, then the vulnerabilities that were used, including the current infection, is going to be gone. So yes, it resolves basically both problems.
Another question we have here for you, Matthias. Are there any indications of AI supported development here?
Um, that's a harder one to answer. So let's say it's super hard to differentiate between the case here if it's the exploit developer that actually built something and if it's the threat operator. Given all the documentation, what we have seen, what we believe is that the exploit broker or developer basically implemented a couple of like, how this is how you could use our exploits in order to exfiltrate data. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't have also just extended or built by the like developer itself. I wouldn't say it doesn't look like AI was really used a lot in this. But if it was used just for like building some part of the implant, not really as a part of building the exploits, these tools are not really yet at a stage that they have the internal knowledge and documentation on iOS that they can be really used very, very well in building out the entire exploitation. They can definitely be used in assisting vulnerability discovery.
Cool. So another one question here. It says, for those that are willing to trade off the limitations of lockdown daily, is it worth keeping on? Have threat actors focused on bypassing lockdown, or do they just focus on the devices that are not using lockdown and move on?
Um, I mean, it's you need to know if the usability issues is worth the security risk or not, depending on your risk profile. As long as you're keeping your devices up to date, and you don't have an elevated risk profile, I would not say lockdown mode is worth it. If you're running outdated versions, it's definitely a different story. And if you have a higher risk profile, I would still continue using it, but I would also suggest using additional tooling such as an EDR software or continuous forensic checks of your phone and even collecting data if you have that higher elevated risk profile. And doing regular checks on a phone is just suggested because you never know if you might have caught something else and at least you can check backwards.
Excellent. So another question here is are there any indications
Oh,
of the
sorry, Spencer. I just overlooked a second part of the question about bypassing lockdown mode. There is no public disclosure of threat actors being able to do this, but I wouldn't say this is completely impossible. And there is probably going to be some people that have been building bypasses around lockdown mode. For example, not every user space application is going to be protected by lockdown mode. So if you find a way into WhatsApp or you find a way into Signal or other of these threat messages, and then you start attacking the system from there, it is definitely possible to bypassing this. And we have seen, for example, that Graphite had like exploits, Paragon's Graphite had exploits for WhatsApp.
Thank you. So, well, another question here. Are there any primary, are there any indications of primary e-criminal markets or distribution channels for this? Yeah,
Ooh,
are there online access brokers selling it? I mean, for
not
instance, we know Coruna was sold through Operation Zero, which is a Russian access broker. So we definitely have evidence of Coruna being sold in secondary markets. But has there been any evidence of this one being sold?
Yeah, I've spoken also about the gut feeling at this point in time that we believe that this was like the transient leaks in the Corona case. I would say I have a similar gut feeling that we're going to see a developing market for end-day exploits, which are sold to different groups of people. Now, both of these cases, Corona and here, had such a bad OPSEC that they were like, let's say, easily discovered, but could have been also easily stolen, which now shows us that it looks like these groups can get access to these tools. And that is a complete shift in momentum to what we have seen previously. Um, So I would also guess it might have been distributed by the same exploit broker, like Operation Zeros, that also just decided to sell this to different places. But it could be also that there is an entirely new market that is currently developing. We'll see if our like public discoveries are going to make an impact on this. Um, but like ourselves, like everyone, we all have to make a living, and it looks like these specific people were totally fine making a living and distributing these chains, and I don't see currently any indication why they should not continue doing this.
Excellent. There's a question. Has there been any response from Apple to our research?
The fun one that I would can tell you is something like, "Why are you sending this on a Friday afternoon?" Because it also means they had to work all the weekend on this. No, we've disclosed this to Apple, but it has been like previously disclosed by Google's threat intelligence group, and all the vulnerabilities were already patched. Um, I haven't received any other specific feedback yet, but we'll see. I could be expecting that there might be, or hopefully is going to be additional iOS patches that are like backported to iOS 17, and the missing pack bypass is also backported. We have seen that in the Coruna case that Apple did that even for older versions. I would say I would be expecting that this is going to happen. But I mean, I obviously cannot predict. Apple decides whatever they want to do. The company is known for that, and they're usually sticking to that particular strategy.